Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, everyone. And welcome to the second in our series of ChemSpider webinars around chemistry data. In putting this program together, we wanted to highlight a range of initiatives where chemistry data is really at the forefront of research, applications, enabling standards and infrastructure, and best practices for now and the future. I'm Richard Kidd, the head of chemistry data at the RSC, and I'm delighted today to have 4 experts in their fields to talk to you about different aspects of chemistry data. Lynn Kamerlin will be talking about a data explosion in chemistry, Simon Coles around another cut of the future view, and then May and Anya to finish covering what data sharing looks like in RSC's journals. So Mark Archibald is also here to help make sure everything works behind the scenes. And some housekeeping to start off. The webinar is being recorded. Each talk will be 15 minutes, and we'll have some time for questions and discussion at the end. Please ask any questions through the Q&A function, and mention if you're directing those towards a particular speaker, and we may be able to pick those up during the webinar itself. It's been an on-demand webinar, so it's being recorded and it'll be available for 12 months through the registration link that you've got. And I'd also like to thank our sponsor, Revity Signals, and supporters, Collaborative Drug Discovery, and other initiatives that you'll hear about both today and in the rest of the webinar program. So let's get started. I'll stop sharing. Our first speaker is Lynn. Over to you, Lynn.
Thanks so much, Rich, for the introduction, and everyone can hear me okay, right?
Yeah.
Perfect. So I'm going to start with a bit more of a high-level talk. So I'm going to give you an introduction, set the scene, before we pass on to Simon and the other speakers. And so my title is perhaps a bit gloriously framed: Data Explosion in Chemistry. What are we going to do with all the data, and what will it do to us? But it's clear that data and digitalization is changing chemistry, and that's what I'm going to give you my introduction about. So I'm a computational chemist or biophysicist, and I've basically been doing this for about 20 years. So in my world, of course, digitalization, this is how you do chemistry, right? So as data explodes, this is just an evolution of my field. But the thing that I'm seeing is a big transition in how everyone else views us. So I remember when I was an undergraduate far too long ago, the RSC had this "Not All Chemists Wear White Coats" campaign. And even then, I mean, for a large part of my independent career and my training, like, my experimental colleagues had this attitude: never trust a computational chemist, and everything you produce is just random numbers. And so people have warmed up to that over time. And where things are changing is that now everything is so digitalized that I hear basically even my experimental chemists or students are talking about needing to deal with the code for their machine. You're perhaps writing code to control a microscope. You have mountains of experimental data you need to analyze, or you're even using, for example, AI to guide your experimental work. And so this, of course, has a big impact because it means that while I grew up scientifically in a world where there are really clear distinctions between disciplines, the breakdown of these traditional barriers between experimentalists and theorists is in full force, and digitalization is unavoidable. And so just some examples of how the data explosion is revolutionizing chemistry. And these are really just a few examples because big data, digitalization, AI, machine learning, other aspects of computer science are affecting chemistry across the board. But for example, a really, really popular area right now is the use of large language models, which are really important for both structural biology and chemistry. And these are coming from digital humanities, and they work on the principle of turning words into structures, molecules, and chemical reactions. But of course, training a large language model requires a lot of computer science background and epic infrastructure. So as I always tell my students, it's not an accident that you see these huge language models, for example, for protein structure prediction, being developed by companies like Google and Facebook that have the infrastructure. But for example, AI is changing drug discovery, human health, chemical synthesis. You have digital chemistry and material science, so you can use basically digital chemistry for prediction, designing new polymers and functional materials. I'm a protein engineer, and so machine learning is really important for enzyme design, which in turn is important for sustainable chemistry. And we think a lot about digital chemistry and how it impacts research and the science around us. But digital chemistry also impacts our workflows, right? It impacts how we communicate with each other as scientists, how we store our data from electronic lab notebooks. But we have virtual lab meetings. We're meeting in this webinar. We collaborate with people from every corner of the world, and we can talk to them in real time. And so digitalization in chemistry also changes how we interact and communicate with each other as scientists. Now, the really crucial thing, because this webinar and this series of webinars are on various aspects of digital chemistry. So the thing is that digital chemistry means different things to different people. So for me as a computational biophysicist, everything I do involves computers, right? So molecular simulations and everything surrounding that. But to synthetic organic chemists, for example, when they think of digital chemistry, they think of AI to guide synthesis. Pharmaceutical chemists might think of AI in drug discovery. A structural biologist might think of databases or protein structure prediction models, so things like AlphaFold. And so one senior colleague, when I mentioned this webinar, asked me, what is digital chemistry? And so I asked 4 colleagues from different disciplines the same question, and I got 4 answers. And so I think if you're attending the full webinar series, but also just dive into this digital chemistry field, you'll get a feeling of that, because you'll see that there's going to be differences in how different people are going to present digital chemistry to you. But clearly, the main thing is that we're now working with epic amounts of data. So there's a cool Vox.com cartoon. I'm not sharing the cartoon itself for copyright reasons, but the general gist is we've decided to take big data to the next level, humongous data. And this is a problem even for people like me, who come from a background in biophysics, because how are we going to analyze this data? How are we going to store this data? What are we going to do with all this data? So this really changes the big data pipeline architecture to something that's very, very different from how we used to do chemistry. And it creates a paradigm shift, because it impacts how we obtain data, our experimental and computational workflows, how we store data. You get major infrastructure challenges as data gets huge. How we curate data, how do we make our data understandable to others? If you don't have metadata, other people won't really have a clue what you're doing. And also there are a lot of questions around sharing. The infrastructure and curation I touched on, but there are also legal aspects, what, when, things like export control, do you want to do a patent, etc. And so really you have these new ways of working with data, which means you need new skills, you need approaches. And so digital chemistry is changing chemistry at every different level. And another important thing, I told you that digital chemistry means different things to different people. So data also means different things to different people. And different disciplines have different data needs. So this can be anything from Excel spreadsheets to petabytes of data. So you can basically just be making tables, figures, have an electronic lab notebook. If you're doing climate science, if you're doing hardcore computational biology on big systems, if you want to train a large language model, you have very, very different data needs and everything in between. And so I joked to my husband, who's also a biophysicist, and my students, if I wanted to talk about the major concern for my discipline, it's infrastructure, because we're maybe not petabytes, but we're in the hundreds of terabytes scheme. And there isn't really good storage mechanisms, because we have, our field has developed very fast. So CERN, for example, has had to think about these things for a very long time. They have data sharing pipelines in place, they have infrastructure in place. But for chemistry, this data explosion has come much faster than infrastructure is caught up. And so if I wanted to condense the future and our concerns into one slide, it would be as simple as give us more infrastructure. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. So we really need an infrastructure revolution. We need this revolution to be able to analyze, store, and disseminate the data. And we really need to come together and come up with new solutions. And this is at every level. And there are questions of who stores what. I think the subsequent speakers will basically touch on this, but what goes with a journal article, what goes into data repositories, what goes in to the researcher's obligation to store. And so this particular workflow is cloud alternatives. But just to give you a perspective for the levels of data that we work with, first of all, often the data is in a different place from where we're doing the calculations, and not just in a different building, but it could be in a different city or country, or I'm in Atlanta right now, it could be in a different state. When you're dealing with huge data, transferring that data is really challenging. So it can still be easier for me to get on an airplane, go to the supercomputing center with physical hard drives and take the data like that, than try to download a petabyte of data over any sort of internet connection. And so the issue of storage and access and open data in this big digital world where we do have these huge data models is, of course, a really important one. So skills training, I can't emphasize this enough. I was basically for a while part of a European Commission working group on open science skills training for researchers. And we have a fairly large report. There's so many different types of skills you need. You need to, of course, learn how to code because you have to interface with this. You have to learn legal aspects. You have to learn practical aspects. And so also a really important thing is, where are you going to store your data? Some of it will be with the paper. A lot of societies and publications are actually working on building data repositories that go for data published with them. But you have to also think about where you're going to store things otherwise, right? So structural biologists, for example, have been using the Protein Data Bank for a very long time. There are so many other data repositories and code repositories. Some are free, some are not. Some are likely to be around for a long time, some are not. What are they going to do with your data? But it's important because not just papers need to be open access, and it's something to think about. And again, in the issue of training, so for example, a structural biologist knows basically that the Protein Data Bank or the Cambridge Crystallographics, the CCSD for small molecules, there are well-established disciplinary places you're going to put your stuff. But of course, if your field is new to large-scale data storage, you also need training to identify reputable and safe places to store your data, because you don't want to store everything somewhere that in 3 years might not exist. So then there's the issue of communication. So there's something called the FAIR principles for open data. And so the FAIR data principles are as simple as this figure. This is from Foster Open Science. And I like the little cartoons because they make things obvious. So FAIR, apart from the obvious fairness aspect, it's also an acronym. You want your data to be findable so that other people can see it, right? And in a big cloud of noise. You want it to be accessible, otherwise it's kind of pointless if other people can't access it. You want it to be interoperable. If you do more computational work, you've all had to deal with what is this file format, what do I do with it, for example. But also licensing is really important. So for example, two of the figures that I've used in this presentation are CC by NC ND, non-commercial node derivatives. And I had to check with Rich to make sure this is a non-profit. What does a license mean? So what kind of license you apply to your data will really impact how other people can use it. And so there's this Go Fair initiative, which is a large initiative with different working groups trying to make things fair in different disciplines. And there's a Go Fair initiative for chemistry data. This is something that's been endorsed by IUPAC. And so, as the name suggests, they're working on fair standards for chemistry. So there is this chemistry implementation network. I'm not sure if it still exists because the link is now broken and it says it's gone. But essentially, there are these guiding principles for this chemistry implementation network. I won't read through them, but you can find them if you go to gofair.org. But they have to do with basically how you implement fair findability, reuse. Data standards are really important. They also comment on tools and infrastructure, persistent identifiers, DOIs, machine readability, so you can search things, management and oversight, again, data standards. And also, this is really important. We're chemists, but I'm also a biologist, right? Physicists, material scientists, there's many disciplines that use chemistry data. We need chemical data standards that also apply to other disciplines. And so this is something that IUPAC, for example, has been working a lot. So IUPAC is really pushing for digital standards for chemistry. And there are many different projects. Again, there's a website link for that. So there's these are complete projects. There's an international chemical identifier. There's ThermoML, which is a standard for thermodynamic property data. JCAMP-DX is for spectral data exchange. But there's many other projects in progress. SMILES Plus, machine accessible periodic table, how you do data management of spectroscopic data, and so on and so forth. But again, you know, this whole idea of constantly inventing the wheel. As things become digital, we do need to communicate with each other in the same language. So having globally accepted digital standards for chemistry are really important. And then the last thing, because I know I'm running out of time, so I care a lot about skills and training. And so just briefly, I was an undergraduate 98 to 2002. That was a time when Comp Chem was really just starting to come into degrees. And so what we had was very, very minimal. It was in the final year of my chemistry degree, but I had a wonderful, wonderful lecturer who's a big part of the reason I'm a biophysicist today. But I mean, it wasn't really a thing, right? Whereas now you have basically dedicated courses in digital chemistry, this revolution in skills training. I'm hosting an EU Erasmus student, so this EU traineeship in digital skills is part of the mobility schemes. And it's clear that chemistry degrees today look nothing like 20 years ago, and that the current and next generation of chemists are going to live with data, computers, and workflows that my scientific parents and grandparents would not recognize at the time I was an undergraduate. And so this is a picture of a subway station in DC. I really like this subway station. It's got this epically long staircase with a light at the end of the tunnel. I've given talks on the future of computational biology and chemistry in all sorts of contexts. And for years, I've been talking how the future is bright, but it's because it is. So things are exciting. There's so much forward momentum. Now this is going into all sorts of other disciplines like integrative structural biology. We have interdisciplinarity. We have amazing data sets we need to learn how to use. We can tackle massive complexity and collaborative research on scale we've never seen before. So the future is exciting. I'm going to wrap up here because you have other great speakers coming after me. And so I'm looking forward to our discussion at the end of the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lynn. That was great and also perfectly to time. Right, up next, our next speaker is Simon Coles, standing in, not just standing in, but I think we'll get the best of both contributions from Simon and Jeremy. Off you go, Simon. I think we've just got your presenter view again, and you're still muted. Yep.
I apologize for that. Yep. After all this time, I've not managed to master Zoom. Okay, there's my title slide. Sorry. For those of you who are expecting Jeremy Fay, who was scheduled to be presenting this webinar today, I'm afraid he can't be with us, and I'm standing in. I like to think I'm quite a good stand-in for Jeremy. I've been working with him for over 20 years in the area of chemical information, and so I think I could predict what he's going to say quite readily, and don't really need an AI. But if you've to kind of give this presentation, but if you've ever met Jeremy, you might find him kind of stochastic and blue skies thinking, and therefore actually predicting what he's going to say cannot always be entirely accurate. However, most of the slides I have today are based on his, so I think I'd like to be able to improve the accuracy of my model today in terms of presenting what Jeremy would have liked to have said in some ways. And he's been giving this talk entitled "Will AI Can an AI Win the Next Nobel Prize?" So I think that's important to consider when we're understanding, trying to look at the impact of chemical information going forward. The subject of this webinar. So AI is the new kid in town, if you like. However, it isn't really the new kid in town. We've been through sort of boom and bust cycles with AI, if you like, since the 1950s. But it's definitely become prevalent these days, and that can be mirrored in some respects to the development of technology. So AI is developed by clever mathematicians, but it's the implementation through using computing machines, if you like, that has enabled its growth. And I show here where I think we're now arriving at, if you like. So we're at the era where computers are essential. And the question is, one of the questions for this webinar is whether we're at the point where computers, or we will reach the point where computers take over and humans won't be necessary anymore. So right now, and in the last few years, I think we've seen a large uptick in the volume of publications out there in material science, chemistry, related subject areas. But the question is whether, well, I would posit that these are actually as a result of computers helping us do more things that humans would do, but just doing them faster. Okay, so the question is whether we really are actually AI ready or not, or just doing what we've always been able to do, but in greater volumes. So I think going forward, we need to be a little bit more insightful. We need to be creative, think laterally, and be efficient with what we're doing. And so I show this cycle that we need to consider, really. But unfortunately, it's a sort of ever-decreasing cycle in some respects. We're in the position where we clearly can't synthesize every chemical compound out there in order to cover chemical space and discover new important compounds with useful properties. So we need to reduce the number of experiments that we're conducting, and to be able to do that, we need ways of reducing the synthesis space and deciding what it is that we're going to make. And for that, traditionally been using predictive models, so we need a good predictive model for that. And in principle, the use of an AI would enable us to be able to do that very well. However, we do need access to lots of good quality data. And where we are at the moment, that requires a lot of good experiments to be able to provide the platform that we need to be able to generate good predictive models. So we get back round to this sort of vicious circle that we need to do lots of good experiments to generate the data we need to tell us the kind of experiments that we need to do. So we end up in a vicious circle. As far as predictive models are concerned, I think we've kind of we've been able to do statistically based modeling for quite some time now. That's based on islands of data, if you like. So very good data you can extrapolate from that. And often we conduct studies specifically, experimental studies specifically, so that we can generate enough data to generate statistical models and be predictive in terms of what similar kind of compounds can do, what kind of activity they might have. And this table in front of you kind of is a Donald Rumsfeld matrix of known knowns and known unknowns, if you like. So in theory, we kind of understand the equations, the models behind the theory, and the data required to prove it. We've been operating in a world with statistical modeling where we understand the relevant data. The equation and the model might be a bit of a known unknown. Machine learning enables us to, in principle, strike out into fields where the data itself is a known unknown, and the model is a known unknown, and that's a sort of strength and a bit of a weakness. So we need to be able to map and cover chemical space for discovery purposes, if you like, and it's this first law of geography that I often refer to, that everything is related to everything else in chemistry, depending on how you boil it down. But near things are more closely related than things that are further away from each other. And so I use this analogy of world maps to kind of illustrate where I think we've been coming from on the left. This map on the left is one of the first maps that is ever printed, i.e. was drawn and printed in order to share information that enable others to chart the territories. Whilst I think we're moving towards a kind of map that we have on the right, which has quite a lot of the space charted, if you like, but there are still areas where we can kind of fall off the edge of the world, as it were, or whole uncharted territories where we simply haven't yet explored. And so this example in the middle of mapping chemical space is a kind of classical one for using characterization or analytical techniques. We might be exploring a multi-dimensional space, but we can measure a number of factors and make correlations relatively easily. So this top example, I think, is one that lends itself pretty well to statistical QSAR style modeling, and now is being quite successful through the application of AI techniques and exploring new uncharted territory. But chemical space is not just big, it's very highly dimensional depending on the size of your problem. So we have to kind of think of this a bit more like chemical space-time. And in order to implement AI approaches, we need to think a little bit about what we mean by related, what we mean by proximity. As in higher dimensions, that's less obvious. So really, this lower example of chemical space, where we have great complexity and diversity and a large number of dimensions, kind of lends itself to AI approaches, but there's a very long way to go before we can actually cover that territory. And a lot of that boils down to the fact that we don't have enough data to actually model. So we're in a position where we have some trusted data repositories and resources, such as the CSD and PDB that Lynn mentioned earlier on. And so this figure below is a log plot of the number of entries we have in structural databases, both 3D structure and other chemical structures, and they're increasing at a great rate. So we're discovering more of this chemical space, and we're quite good at defining structure. But in fact, the majority of data is actually unstructured. Not only is it not particularly accessible or readily accessible, but it's in very difficult to process formats, and a very large proportion of it has never actually left the laboratory. So whilst I think we're beginning to move towards an ecosystem that has some repositories, we're applying standards to an extent in some areas. We're able to understand how to use metadata and how to describe our data to an extent. We kind of put tags on our data. We're quite a long way away from structuring our data in a way in which artificial intelligence could use it most optimally. And so I feel there's the culture change required. At the moment, we're spending an awful lot of time trying to extract data from scientific literature and other places, and that extraction is hugely time consuming. So a lot of time and effort by clever people has devised very elegant ways in which we can extract information from the literature, but really it shouldn't be necessarily in that form in the first place. And when we've managed to extract it, then an awful lot of time is spent trying to convert it. And therefore, there's a real need for data standards, if you like. And so that's where I think we currently are, and there's actually a desperate need for form of data infrastructures. So this is where I get to advertise what we're up to at the moment, but it's quite generic. So this is how we see a physical sciences data infrastructure being built here in the UK, and it shows how data needs to flow through the various different stages of its life, how there's quite a lot of management of that data that's required during those processes, and that the data needs to be reusable and exposed so that it can be discovered, and machines can actually make use of it. And so if I try and kind of make the links here between the data resources, we need to be able to capture things at the stage when they're being planned, or when experiments are being conducted, and for that to flow through, whether it's conventionally publishable or not, in order to be able to be structured and made available in more trusted and usable form for machines to actually process and do something with. So there's a whole load of tooling associated with this this data infrastructure, and we're quite a long way from achieving many of those components. So I think certainly in terms of AI, we're in a bit of a liminal period, as in there's a gap between different kinds of technologies being imposed or used, and there is a very key concern that we may actually over rely on AI and put ourselves into what we call here intellectual debt. I'm a scout leader, and if I hand a piece of paper with a load of contours on it to my scouts, I can guarantee you we certainly won't get where we want to go. But all of them can follow a mapping app on their phone and get to where they need to go. So actually, we're putting ourselves into a bit of an intellectual debt there potentially. And there's the obvious requirement for ethical and explainable AI. Being able to scrutinize and understand how models were developed, and therefore how discoveries have been made, is absolutely essential. And we're quite a long way from being able to do that. We don't understand the provenance of the data. We need benchmark models and data for AI so that we can see how well we're doing when we propose something new. And we're a long way from being able to do that. So this is my kind of a graphic of how I think we are evolving in terms of chemistry data. I've been down at this left-hand end for quite some time, the last 20 years, standing on a soapbox. I think we're beginning to climb up this slope where we're able to start developing data infrastructures and tools that are actually useful for chemists. And what that should then become is a ubiquitous system that supports chemistry research. And the question is how far and how quickly we get along this trajectory to the point where data science drives all chemistry research and we don't necessarily need to go into the laboratory again. So not sure whether we'll ever actually get to that standing position, and I'm very reluctant to put an actual scale of time on that axis below. So I'll just wind up now by doing the obvious, and that's asking an AI whether it thinks a Nobel Prize will ever replace the chemist, and it actually comes up with the conclusion that AI could potentially play a critical role, but a Nobel Prize will be awarded to human scientists who actually develop the methods. And that's kind of backed up by the inimitable Derek Lowe in the Chemistry World publication, where he essentially says the machines aren't going to replace this, they're just a tool, and we're going to be the driving force. So I think if we tried to give an AI a Nobel Prize right now, it would probably not happen, because we really don't have the fundamental foundations for ubiquitous AI right now. And that's me drawn to a close. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks, Simon. Yeah, it's as both yours and Lynn's talks illustrated, the scale and the coverage of the bits of the jigsaw that fit together are really enormous. Okay, so before we get to a discussion session, our final speakers, hand over to May and Nadia.
Thanks very much, Rich, and hello everyone. And I work at the RSC. I'm one of the editors of one of our journals, and so I'm going to give you a little bit of a perspective of how we've been looking at data and data sharing at the RSC. And my colleague Anya is going to dive into some sort of specific journal examples on her journal, Digital Discovery. But first of all, I'm going to sort of take it up to a slightly higher level and talk about sort of some of the work that the RSC has been doing around open science and how this links with what we believe to be what can make up a positive science culture, which is ultimately where we believe we should all be aiming. So we envisage that a science culture that supports everybody should be open and inclusive and really enabling for sort of chemists to really fulfill and help tackle some of the sort of the big global challenges that we have. And so we've developed this vision for a positive science culture, and we believe it's sort of really key in helping to sort of foster this kind of environment. And one of the sort of three foundations of that great science culture is scientific practice. How do we conduct science? And it should be conducted in a rigorous, ethical, and responsible way. And also, effective science is open and collaborative. So coming back to this idea of open science and sharing of knowledge and expertise across disciplines, across sectors and countries. And our vision for this also obviously goes more specific into looking at scientific data, recommending that data is deposited in an accessible repository, and as our first two speakers have said, really making sure that any tools and any data are presented and shared in a useful way, and that data meets the principles of the FAIR principles. So hopefully most people will be familiar with the term open science, but just to share with you this graphic from UNESCO, really showing the different aspects of open science, that scientific knowledge should be openly available, accessible and reusable for everybody, and really this will help increase collaboration and for the benefit of science and society, and that's from the United Nations. And you can see where in the green that's open scientific knowledge, and that open data is a core part of that. But actually, I think Lynn also touched upon open science infrastructures as well, being a really key part of this this whole environment. And just to say, the RSC have also made a commitment to open science, and so this is sort of part of the drivers for our work, because we genuinely believe that will really help empower chemical scientists to really make the world a better place if knowledge is shared equitably and there is global access to knowledge and data. So just to touch upon and call out some of the work that's already been going on, and we actively support the development of open data standards, and the RSC was a founding member of the INCHI Trust. We work closely with our UPAC as well. Again, referenced earlier the important work on looking at minimum information standards and sort of developing standards for data management of different data types, and really RSC wants to be very much involved in those discussions and helping where we can as a link with the community. And I know as part of this webinar series, members of the NFDI for Chem have been involved, and they are fantastic advocates for open data and really making taking very positive action to engage with publishers, to engage with the community about how we can actually make sure that data that is being published in our journals is fair and is achieving these objectives. So coming back to what are we doing at the RSC, as I hope you realise, we're now very much supportive of making data associated with any publications in our journals fair, and making sure that researchers can get access to that data and reuse where appropriate. And as part of that, we say that we do strongly encourage the deposition of any data underpinning any research published in our journals in an appropriate repository. We do recognise that actually in chemistry, the majority of the data that goes alongside the articles we publish end up in supporting information. I think that's it's a first step, but it really isn't the ideal because it's not particularly fair. It's not able to be findable, that first aspect. So really encouraging authors to choose repositories over supplementary information is really something that we're very keen on, and we want to put things in place to help authors do that. I say these are quite general statements that apply across all of our journals. We do have some more specific data guidelines for some journals, and Anya is going to talk about the ones for digital discovery, where obviously data is at the heart of that journal. So in terms of how should you go about choosing a repository if you're at that stage of wanting to publish your research but you don't know where to share your data? Lynn mentioned there's lots of choice out there, but here are some sort of basic criteria that we would recommend people consider. You certainly would like a repository to be able to provide a persistent identifier, a DOI number alongside to go with the data set, so that can be referenced and linked to, and also to allow you to provide as much information as possible alongside your data. This is the metadata, so again, to be able to provide that information to allow other researchers to reuse it in a sort of a meaningful way. And to also be able to provide linking of that data set to something like an article publication. So there is that linking through of where that data sits and the context that it has. Obviously, we would like repositories also to sort of link to things like author IDs, ORCID, and those kind of things, to really make sure that the right people are getting credit for that data about who produced it. And again, really importantly, making sure that there are different licensing options available in terms of making that data under a CC BY or whatever kind of license is required. Again, it can be a really overwhelming thing trying to choose the right repository. So there are tools and support out there, and there are some repository registries and on re3data.org and fairsharing.org are two resources that you could go to look for suitable repositories. And a number of publishers have also started to put recommendations on their websites as well. So that leads me nicely into the recommendations that we've developed as sort of a subject discipline, a chemistry publisher. We've put together a guide for specific repositories that we think are reputable, that are recognised by the community, that we see our community using for different data types. And hopefully this kind of information on our website will be a useful starting place if you're looking for a repository for a specific type of chemical data. The obvious ones that we're very familiar with, the CSD for crystallographic small molecule data, the protein data bank for larger data sets are just a couple of examples, but there are some more here to get you started. Alternatively, if there isn't a discipline-specific repository, then we can recommend some either more generalist repositories, such as Dryad, and there could be fees for these. So we've tried to sort of call out where where that might apply, and also explore any institutional repositories, perhaps with your librarians and your colleagues, to see whether that's an option for you as well. And really importantly, we need to call out in the journal articles where this data can be found. And this is why data availability statements are an incredibly important part of the manuscript, and we strongly encourage all our authors to include one in their articles. And really, it's about summarizing where that data can be found. It could be a really big data set in a repository, or it even could be data within a table or a figure. But the data availability statement can be used to reference either of those and immediately draw attention to the reader about where they can find the data for that particular aspect. And that we find that data availability statements are a great way to support that sort of communication of where that data can be found, to make sure it's available for reuse. So at that point, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Anya, and she's going to talk a little bit about data in digital discovery.
Thank you, May. And hello, everyone. I'm Asmay, one of the editors at the RSC. And while my colleague was talking just a moment ago about general open data policies at the RSC and why we're doing this, I would like to focus more specifically on the case of digital discovery, which is the journal that by far has the strongest data policy in our portfolio. I need to say a few words first about digital discovery, which is a gold open access journal that publishes research on AI, automation, and in general, high throughput data science or molecular discovery. Next slide, please. Accessibility of data and code associated with computational research published in the journal is absolutely essential for reproducibility, as majority of my speakers mentioned. And this is why we decided to apply strict open data requirements in the journal. And however, we recognize that at times, especially when the research is produced by or in collaboration with private companies, there are limitations to what can be made openly available. And thus, we don't mandate full data deposition. What we do is strongly encourage our authors to deposit their code in the open repositories, while the data necessary to reproduce the research must be deposited and freely available before submission. In any way, code and data must be submitted alongside the manuscript and made available for editors and reviewers at the time of peer review. So to simply say, the code does not necessarily has to be made open, while data, especially if it's required to reproduce the result, has to be available openly. And in any way, both have to be submitted, even if only for reviewers and editors to look into. Next slide, please. At the digital discovery, we recruit a data reviewer who is a third additional reviewer in addition to regular reviewers, and this person thoroughly checks the data and its reusability. They ensure that things like accessibility, data representation, model training are right, and also run the code to make sure that it does what the authors claim it should be doing. If the code or data are proprietary and cannot be publicly released at the time of peer review, the authors are required to discuss this with the editor. And the editor then works with the author to ensure that the published results are reproducible and of use to the journal readers. So we want the journal to be inclusive as much as possible, and at the same time as useful for the readers and researchers as we can be. Next slide, please. So I chose a couple of examples to show the work of the editors and the authors and what we deem acceptable and what not for publication in the journal. So the first example is when the author unexpectedly could not get clearance from their industrial partners for open data. And the code and data associated with the manuscript couldn't be provided for the time of peer review. And because of that, the work was rejected. And that was quite obvious example of what is unacceptable to be published in the journal. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Anya. About a minute left, if that's possible.
Okay, next slide, please. Yep, one more. Oh, sorry. Yeah, no, sorry, we have to get back. Sorry, I made a mistake. I thought that I already talked about it. Well, yeah, so you already know what happened with that paper. In that particular case, the authors could release their own code, but all described work in the paper builds on the proprietary models from OpenAI. So the reviewers wouldn't be able to access the models without a paid subscription. And even though we suggested that authors provide API access for reviewers and editor, they couldn't be able to provide it, and the work was rejected. And the last example, if you can, yes, thank you. And the last example is a manuscript which was at first rejected because the authors did not make the code available at the time of submission, but then they resubmitted their manuscript with proprietary source code that they made available to the editor and reviewers. And their data set was available deposited in the public repository. And in this particular case, the paper was accepted, and that was acceptable solution for us. Thank you, May. Yeah, that was the data availability statement from the paper. And that's all actually I have to say. And thank you so much for listening.
That's great. Thanks very much, Anya and May, both of you. What we'll do now, we will try and make the best of our time for the rest of the hour for some of the questions that have come through for the Q&A. Many of them, I think the panelists have been able to answer directly, but let's pick out some of the ones that would be good for a discussion by some of the panelists. We had one from Narasimha Gubbi about major learnings and insights that CERN had already implemented around data and infrastructure and storage, and maybe Lynn, you'd like to pick up on that for sort of learnings that could be translated.
So I think the CERN lesson, it's not just an open science issue, but it's also an issue of scope of science, so authorship, size of collaborations. So for example, if you look at old school chemistry papers, I still found one from a few years ago in an RSC journal from a colleague with one author. But you have more and more people on papers. On biology papers, you have hundreds of people. And then stuff that comes out of CERN, there's one that's a legendary 9,500 people. And so this kind of, it's terrible. It's a 4-page paper. Sorry, it's a 9-page paper with 4 pages of text and 5 pages of author list. So, but effectively, I mean, this is an extreme example, but you can immediately see that you really have to have good data sharing, right? Because how are you going to communicate across 9,500 people? And so disciplines that have had to worry very much about this, CERN is an example, but also people doing large telescope data, climate scientists, and so on. They're getting tremendous volumes of data in real time that they often have to share at CERN in one place. But if you're working with a telescope across the globe, and remember my comment about taking hard drives to another state being easier than downloading a petabyte of data. And so because they've had to do this, they've had to very quickly adapt. So they have epic infrastructure. So their storage facilities are enormous. They have already platforms for quickly sharing and communicating and everything else. It's not that they're somehow geniuses that know secrets that the rest of us don't, or that we're somehow behind. It's more that they've been kind of forced into this situation much more quickly because of the scope of their infrastructure. I think ultimately, as our science expands, I think we're still a ways off from a 9,500 person chemistry paper, but effectively we're moving in the same direction. And so it would be good to see how they do this, just because I'm sure they've made a lot of mistakes. To borrow a senior colleague in a meeting recently, they said that this will work very well from now on because we have made all the mistakes necessary to ensure this is functional. So, but instead of just repeating all the mistakes, if we can see how these big initiatives have done it, we can learn a lot. But we really need to invest in infrastructure. I will hammer this home again and again.
Thanks, Lynn. And maybe a related one about infrastructure. Maybe Simon, you can pick this one up from a question from Sonia Harris-Paulis about should we avoid or rely on commercial solutions such as Google Cloud? As you're feeling about that?
My feeling is that we need to embrace them. These are tools that that chemists use day in, day out. Okay, and so the challenge here really is not whether we should avoid them, but how we can best use them. And I think I use the Microsoft ecosystem as an example. Most academic institutions have a whole set of tools and connected infrastructure provided by Microsoft that supports their work on a daily basis, and there's nothing to stop us from recording everything we do in the lab, for example, in say OneNote, right? So there are tools on top of an infrastructure that allow us to work as we would most comfortably normally work, and I think that's a really important. The usability of infrastructure is absolutely key. So presenting people with tools that they're familiar with and can use is awfully important. The challenge will be to take what's being captured by these tools and stored in commercial infrastructure and structure it so that it's usable in an academic setting. So I don't think we wholly rely on these commercial settings. We need to be able to structure our data and export it from these systems into our own to be able to perform AI or manage the data, make it available to others. So I don't think it's the whole solution, but it's an important part of the answer. And shying away from it's not a good idea. I think we need to look at how we can embellish it more.
Great, thanks very much, Simon. I think there's a couple of questions in there that we might be able to answer, but actually, just as a in the last minute before I do a wrap up, for each of you, what's one thing that you'd like people to take away and think about as a result from this one? May,
I'm going to say the obvious: include a data availability statement in your paper, and don't say ask the authors on request. It really should be, even if it's as simple as the data supporting this work is in the supporting information. That's better than nothing. And if you can go that step further and share in a repository as well, those would be my wish list.
Thanks. Anya? Oh, can't hear you.
Sorry. I said that I don't have much to say to what May just said. I think I would support that.
Okay, Lynn, have you got one, or is it just more infrastructure?
I think more infrastructure is important, but I would actually say skills training. So again, going back to the digital chemistry will mean different things to different people, which really shows how broad this is, and that changes the skills we're going to need. So I think we need our chemistry degrees of now and the future to reflect that.
Perfect. Thank you. Simon?
Skills training, I would wholly agree with, and that sort of engenders culture change, which means we will be able to think about how we structure our data at the point we make it available or the point we capture it. So skills leading into culture change.
Great, thank you everyone. I'm going to wrap up now, Mike, as long as my screen doesn't lock up, which it did just then to take us to the end. So to wrap up, thanks very much for the to all the speakers today, and please fill out the survey on completion to let us know how we did and what else you'd like to know about. Reminder of the next webinar, which is on the 7th of December at 3 p.m. GMT, and the link will be shared in a follow-up email to this webinar, as will the sort of details about how to find the recording if you want to see that again. I've got the same slide up twice. I'd like to thank our sponsors, Revity Signals, and a reminder that you can see the talk from Pierre Moria in the recording from the first webinar. Thanks to our supporters as well, and once again, 1,000 thanks for all the speakers for sharing your expertise, and for the participants for coming to see us and putting so many excellent questions into us. So thank you again. Have a good afternoon, have a good evening, have a good weekend, and we'll hopefully see you for the final webinar in December. Thank you very much.